Welcome to the first of a new series of screencasts focusing on the youth culture section of the Component 1 A-Level Sociology exam. So remember, there are 3 exams that you do at the end of the second year, and the youth culture section is within the first paper, Component 1. So as you can see over here, Component 1 is divided up into 3 sections, and the youth cultures part of the paper is Section B. If you want to remind yourself of the overall structure of the A-Level specification, then go back and have a look at this screencast that gives you all of the details about the A-Level qualification as a whole. So let me begin just by giving you a brief overview of this new topic called youth culture. So what we're going to do in this particular screencast is focus on some of the key concepts that underpin this new topic area. And then in the screencast after that, we start to focus on some of the early research that was done on youth cultures, focusing particularly on the concept of youth subcultures. Then we look at some of the more recent research that's been carried out on youth culture. And some of this recent research has called into question whether or not the concept of a subculture is any longer useful for helping us to understand the experiences of young people. And also, when we're looking at more recent approaches to the study of youth culture, we consider the globalization of youth culture and the influence of wireless communication, so the influence of things like mobile phones on contemporary youth subcultures. And then to round off this particular topic, we'll look at how youth culture is often associated with crime, deviancy and delinquent behaviour. And then finally, as young people spend a lot of their time in formal educational institutions, we will conclude this topic by examining youth culture within the context of schools. So in this introductory screencast, I'm going to introduce you to 3 basic concepts. We're going to look at the concept of youth, the concept of a youth culture, and finally we'll look at the concept of distinctive youth subcultures. And youth can be defined as the period between puberty and the attainment of full adult status. Now, in many traditional pre-industrial societies, initiation into the status of a young adult comes fairly soon after the onset of puberty. So girls may get married and take on domestic responsibilities at quite a young age. Boys may become young warriors at quite a young age. In contrast, in modern Western societies, such as the UK, young people may have to wait a long time between reaching physical maturity and achieving full adult status. And this is often only attained when a young person gets to own their own home, gets a job, and gains financial independence from their parents. So in modern Western society, such as the UK, youth is viewed as an in-between, or to use the jargon, a liminal category between childhood and adulthood. So teenagers hover between childhood and adulthood. So teenagers often try to follow adult ways, but they're treated in law as children. Teenagers might wish to go to work, but they're constrained to stay in school. So youth occupies this ambiguous status in between childhood and adulthood in modern Western societies. And youth as a distinctive social category is often seen as being inherently troublesome and problematic, and as requiring services designed to meet its specific needs. For example, young people are often seen as being inherently more deviant than other sections of society. Now, there are 2 broad perspectives that one might take on the experience of youth. And one perspective that is very popular is the biological perspective. And this is a perspective that sees adolescence as inevitably a difficult period of transition for young people because of the biological changes that are associated with puberty. So this view was popularised at the turn of the 20th century by G. Stanley Hall, who suggested that puberty led to things like greater aggression, a greater awareness of sexuality, which meant that adolescence, in his view, was inevitably a period of storm and stress. However, sociologists and anthropologists have often challenged this biological view of adolescence that sees it as an inevitable time of storm and stress. And sociologists and anthropologists have argued that the experience of youth varies greatly across cultures and across time within the same culture, and that it's not inevitably a period of storm and stress. So from this perspective, the changes that we associate with the period of life that we call youth are primarily a social construction. They're primarily down to culture and to socialization rather than to biological factors. For example, Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist, suggested that the difficulties associated with adolescence in Western society, such as America, had much more to do with the role assigned to young people within those societies than with the biological changes involved in puberty. So Mead argued that in Western societies, teenagers have to endure a long period in which they are neither children nor adults, and they are not required to take on the responsibilities of adulthood, but they're also excluded from many of its privileges. And Mead suggests that this ambiguous status occupied by teenagers in countries like America produces the storm and stress. And in contrast to the experiences of American teenagers, Margaret Mead, in this famous book, Coming of Age in Samoa, described how in Samoa, teenage girls were expected to take on responsibility for many the activities associated with adult women in our society. So, for example, washing, cooking, looking after younger children. And Mead argued that girls of this age were also able to enter into sexual relationships much earlier than was common in the West at the time that she was writing in the 1920s. And she argued that Samoan girls seemed to have fewer problems in moving through adolescence into adulthood in comparison to American teenagers. And even within our own society, the concept of youth as a distinctive social category with special characteristics of its own is a relatively new idea and probably can be traced back to some of the key changes that occurred in British society during the 19th century. So these changes that affected the status of young people included things like legislation. So what we mean here are laws that protected children and young people. For example, the prohibition on many forms of child labour, which created more opportunities for young people to engage in leisure, the extension of schooling for young people during the 19th century, the growth of scientific knowledge, so you begin to get psychological and medical perspectives on the particular problems that young people experience. And also towards the end of the 19th century, you start to get media representations of young people as a problem, as inherently deviant and a threat to social order. Okay, let's now look at this second key concept that I want to cover, the concept of a youth culture. So youth culture is the idea that because young people are now seen as a distinctive social category, that they developed a shared way of life which is different to that of either children or adults. So it's the idea that young people possess many norms and values which are distinctive. And youth culture in particular is often based around particular forms of music, particular forms of fashion, particular forms of slang, and a desire for greater independence and freedom. And sociologists first reported on youth culture within the UK in the 1950s and the 1960s, when older teenagers moving into employment began to benefit from the relative post-war affluence. So after World War II, the economy grew, people's wages grew, and lots of young people were able to use their wages to buy fashionable clothes, pop records, and other products in the emerging youth culture market. And also, because of a demographic bulge in the post-war youth population, because of the so-called baby boomers, youth became highly visible in the post-war period. And this started to generate broad and often exaggerated social anxiety from older people within society. So the development of what came to be known as a generation gap, in which the young appeared to have different values, different interests from their parents' generation, started to emerge as the 1950s progressed and came to fruition in the youth cultures of the 1960s as this bold generation of baby boomers reached the age of majority. Now, the last concept that I want to take a look at briefly is the concept of a youth subculture. So the term youth culture refers to all young people, whereas this term, subculture, refers to particular groups of young people. In other words, a subculture is a group within a group. So within youth culture, there are, of course, many distinct and constantly changing youth subcultures, and these particular subcultures often have very different norms, values, behaviours and styles that vary quite widely. And very often, distinctive youth subcultures are viewed as being highly deviant from the perspective of mainstream society. So although all young people share certain features and characteristics in common, we can also identify and explain the behaviour of different youth groups within this category on the basis of their particular subcultural characteristics. And subcultures are often based on social factors such as people's social class background, their gender, their ethnicity, where they live in the country, and so on. And the sociologist Paul Hodgkinson, based on research that he did on the goth youth subculture, has identified three key features that youth subcultures share. Firstly, there's the importance that youth cultures attach to developing a very distinctive style. So if we take the goth youth subculture, even though there's some diversity within the subculture, goths are relatively easy to recognise as belonging to that particular subculture. Secondly, there's the idea of being committed to the subculture. So members are committed to their group to the extent that it influences their lifestyle and their everyday life. So to influence the choices that they make about the clothes that they wear, the music that they listen to, where they go out, the friends that they develop. And thirdly, members of a distinctive youth subculture, like the goth youth subculture, have a strong sense of group identity. So members must feel that they're part of the group and see themselves to some extent as being different from outsiders. So in other words, membership of a youth subculture is a primary source of identification for the young people that are involved in it. Now, early sociological research on youth subcultures tended to focus on the more spectacular street-based youth subcultures. So these were subcultures where the participants dressed in flamboyant ways, were noisy in public places, and appeared to behave in a defiant way to attract attention. And in class, so that you've got some important background knowledge on the development of youth culture, we'll look at some case studies, some particular examples of some of the spectacular youth subcultures that emerged in Britain in the post-war period.